Hello, family. It's your sister Jocelyn here, and welcome to another episode of Faith on the Journey. If this is your first time tuning in, we welcome you. We are so glad that you are here and want you to know that we're committed to helping you strengthen your faith, heal your heart, and discover a sense of community. And we do so through a variety of ways by connecting you with a team of Christian counselors and offering trauma healing trainings across the country. You can learn about these resources and so much more by visiting our website at faithonthejourney.org. Again, that is faithonthejourney.org. Now, today we're welcoming to the show a woman who I had the pleasure of working with in ministry. We're both a part of the Rise Network for Women in Ministry, Women of Color in Ministry. And she is doing this work on a large scale around trauma healing. Reverend Dr. Myrna Thurman Malone is a wife, mother, of three adult children with 20 plus years of serving in different ministries. I mean, she's been doing a lot of work. She also has so many degrees that I can't name them all here. Just say she has alphabet soup behind her name. She is the author, I think is I counted maybe 10 books, several books around trauma. She has served as an adjunct professor at several universities in the Atlanta area. Dr. Myrna loves music, praise dance, writing, and utilizes the practice as a means of self care. And she's just such a sweet sister. I'm extremely excited to welcome Dr. Myrna on the show today. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, I definitely wanted to have you because I remember when I was working on one of my book projects and I was interviewing you on the topic of reauthoring your story and trauma and the healing process. You provided tremendous insight. And I wanted to have that for my audience as well. But before we get into the topic of today, which is reauthoring our stories, I'm just curious, why are you so passionate about working in this field around trauma healing?
Well, it started with my own story and not having enough safe and sacred spaces for me to be able to go into the gifts of healing that I needed for myself, where my spirituality was welcomed in the space. In addition to that, there weren't therapists or counselors who looked like me. And a lot of times in my experience after doing this research, I just found that sometimes we can go to other therapists or other counselors, but because of the stereotype or the imaging of a strong Black woman, we automatically carry that into the space. And so we can be in a space with a counselor and they can hold that in front of us and not recognize that there's a mask, there's an armoring that's present. And so to be able to have the capacity to be able to deconstruct all of that so we can become unarmored, so we can feel safe. Because in order for someone to tell their story, their true, authentic story, the person on the other end receiving it, they must feel that their story is able to be held and that the person has the capacity to hear and hold our story in its truth, in its full authenticity, and not feel like they have to sugarcoat it or protect someone else because of the harshness of the story. And as Black women, there's a harshness to some of our narratives because of trauma, because of what I call this multiplicity reality, because of racism, sexism, and classism, and other isms that impact us and have impacted our story and how we see ourselves, how we identify, how we enter into relationships, why we walk around armored, why we have the um, understanding that we have to look into this strong Black woman and what does that mean, and so how can we deconstruct that and reframe it to look like something different, right? To understand that we can be vulnerable and be strong. So my tears is part of my strength because I'm able to lament, I'm able to cry out, I'm able to process every pain, every hurt, every harm that was done to me and reframe it in a way that it allows me to be able to use it as my power, right? And so part of reauthoring your story has to do with you being able to deconstruct your narrative from the intensity of living into the harm only to be able to see your resilience, to be able to see myself not just as a survivor, but an overcomer. And that's what I love about what you do because you integrate spirituality. Spirituality is so connected into what we do. And for me, it's my Christian faith, it's my intimate relationship with God because God is the one who reauthored my story and allowed me to see years later how everything, every experience, every harm, every trauma, every hurtful thing that I had experienced, God has used it for my purpose. God has used it to allow me to create a safe and sacred space for other women of color to be able to come in their entire, complete, authentic self, whatever their narrative is, whatever their story is, and create a space for them to be able to share and not feel like, okay, I can share this, but I can't share this. Right. And so all of that is part of reauthoring your story and being able to recognize as pastoral counselors that we have to have a space that invites both the spiritual, the mind, and the body because all are interconnected. Right. And so how can we treat one area of a person and not treat or look or examine the other parts of the person?
That's right. I think sometimes we might fail, not intentionally, excuse me, not intentionally, do we neglect the body or neglect the emotions. But in church, we're conditioned to focus on the spirit, not recognizing that someone really is struggling with something emotionally or how trauma impacts the body. And we are all of these things. We are mind, body, and spirit. We need to care for all of that. So I appreciate you sharing that. I would love for you to back up a little bit because you shared some rich gems. I want you to talk about vulnerability being strength. That is like counter narrative. Can you elaborate on that more?
Mhm. So when I was actually able to find a wonderful pastoral counselor who created this safe and sacred space for me, I was able to see myself other than the trauma. So, yes, I've experienced some harmful, injurious things in my life, from sexual to physical to emotional, sexual abuse, as well as molestation. But that does not define me. It was actually when I went to seminary because the first thing I learned when I was focusing in on psychology of religion was that I needed to have healing myself and I needed to acknowledge and embrace my story. And so at that time, the concept was so foreign. But the good thing was is that there were pastoral counselors that was available for us to be able to schedule some time with to be able to get the work done. And so in that, the pastoral counselor that I had, and who's still my counselor today, she was able to create this safe and sacred space for me and be able to reframe what vulnerability is and be able to reframe what it means to be a strong Black woman, right? Because so much of our identity is connected to strength, right? Strength in the sense of we have to be able to be all, hold all, support all, everyone else but ourselves. And so part of being vulnerable is being able to deconstruct that and reframe it for myself, knowing that, okay, Myrna, it's okay for you to cry because what you've been through, it's amazing that you're still here. Let's just start right there, right? And so being able to acknowledge, okay, this is what I've gone through, but let me step back and look at my qualifications outside of the trauma. Who has God stated that I am? And then being able to learn that. And so, what does the word teach us about being able to lament, about being vulnerable, about being able to cry out? And so, she created that space for me, right? So, that was the beginning. And then once I went on to um, do my postgraduate work and get my doctorate, I continued the study of what does it mean for me to be vulnerable? What does it mean? What does it look like for me to cry out? And how can I reframe it in a way so that other women of color, because that's my area of specialty is Black women, women of color, when they come into a safe and sacred space, how can I help them become unarmored? Because we armor, right? So how can I help them unarmor and be able to explore? their vulnerability. Because if we can step back and be honest with ourselves, most of us are not socialized to be vulnerable. We're socialized to be strong and to take everything in and take everything on and keep on moving, right? Because it would be weak of us, or we would be weak if we was not able to handle A, B, C, D, E, F, G, no matter what comes at us, right? And then when we look at it from a theological framework, especially depending on the denomination or the church you grew up in, is fortified in that, right? No, baby, no, wipe them tears. Wipe them tears from your face. But we have to recognize, and what I learned is I recognize that every place is not a safe place for me. You have to make your own safe and sacred spaces, right? So what that did for me was allowed me to be able to go inward. Because even how I understand trauma as the denial of self actualization. And so when we experience trauma, it denies us to become our authentic self who God created us to be. And so the more I went inward, the more I was able to grow spiritually, and the more I was able to grow emotionally. So you have spiritual maturity and you have emotional maturity, and being able to recognize that they're interrelated, they correlate together, and so not to separate them, right? And that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak, but being vulnerable for me says to me, I know who I am. I know whose I am. I know the reason that I was purposed and created. And no matter what happened to me, it does not define who I am. But God defines who I am. And so that's who I'm going to live into, right? And so I use what I call a Jesus centered model, looking at the life and ministry of Jesus, right? Every time Jesus did something, every time he did a miracle, he went away, which taught me to go away. Every time I poured out, right, I went away to hear from God, to be with God, so that God can pour back into me, right? And a lot of times, part of us holding this mantle or this weight or this unrealistic identity of what it means to be a strong Black woman tells us that we have to not only be the be all for everybody else, but we have to deny ourselves. We have to deny our own pain. We have to deny our own hurt. We have to deny our own trauma instead of in order to continue to move forward. But when we do that, we dishonor our story and our narrative, right? And we have to learn how to get to a place where we can unpack, where we can acknowledge, where we can give voice to and honor our story. So it does not matter that my story was embedded with trauma and grief. What matters is that I am more than that, right? So if I only live into the narrative of being the victim, I'll never see myself as being an overcomer. If I only see myself as a survivor, then I'm going to continue to try to just only survive. But I want to be able to see myself as an overcomer because I done overcame some stuff, right? For me, that is being able to be vulnerable with myself. I'm not denying my pain. I'm not denying my past. I'm not giving kudos or five to the people who hurt me. But what I am doing is I'm acknowledging my story. And when I acknowledge my story, I honor my story. I honor my voice. And I give credit to who God is calling me to be so that I don't remain stuck in the trauma. Because we can walk around when we don't reauthor our story, we can live out of only the story of trauma when there's so much more to me, right? And there's so much more to every woman who has ever experienced trauma, whether it be physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual, right? No matter what type of trauma you've experienced, you are more than that experience, right? And so, how can you give voice to your pain and your hurt and allow you to acknowledge it and process it and work through it so you can move forward? Because when it goes unprocessed and we keep it packed down, then it keeps and has us in yoked up. or it becomes like a stronghold or bondage, right? And that's the trick of the enemy. That is the trick of the enemy, right? He doesn't want us to see our purpose. He doesn't want us to get to the place of our full self actualization of who God is calling us to become, because I believe that we were created for a purpose, right? And so, as long as we only see the pain, as long as we only see the trauma, we'll never get to see the purpose. Like we're living out of that narrative only of trauma, right? And a lot of times we think that if we look past the trauma, that we are giving credence or okaying well whoever did that caused us the trauma, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, it's important for us to be able to create safe and sacred spaces. The persons that is doing this work to empower every woman that comes into our office so that they can reauthor their story from trauma to triumph, so that they can be able to see themselves as more than a conqueror, so that they can know that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, and whatever experience of trauma that they have experienced does not define them, and that the devil is a liar and he comes to kill, steal, and destroy. And so, my work that I do is to make sure that every woman who's ever experienced sexual abuse that comes to see me, when the work that we have finished, the work that we process, the work to acknowledge, because healing is a process and a journey. And we have to recognize that it's about learning how to have healthy ways of coping, right? We have to learn how to cope. We have to learn how to give voice to. We have to learn how to deconstruct. We have to learn how to see ourselves differently, and then we become the author of our story rather than living under the story or the narrative that was projected onto us by whoever caused us the harm, by whoever implemented the trauma in the first place, right? And sadly, in my research, I learned that a lot of Black women, a lot of women of color that I had worked with, were carrying this weight and this burden of this trauma as their narrative. And so by the time they came to me, they was 40, they was 50, they was 60, and the trauma had never been dealt with, had never been spoken. So then we was able to look at, do some mat work to be able to see, well, how has the trauma benefited you? How has it hindered you from moving forward? How has it hindered you, especially when women are called to ministry? How does um, the call and the trauma intersect, and it calls you to allow yourself to become a victim in ministry? Because there are predators out there. Everybody that's working in ministry is not about God's business, right? And so now we have women who had sexual trauma from their past, but because of that trauma narrative that they put in front of people, people can see that trauma, and then they become a target. And so then they not only have this trauma from their childhood, but then they experience trauma again. And I'm talking about sexual trauma in the church, because people don't have self control, right? And because of how we wear our story, right? Other people can pick up on that. That's why it's important for us to be able to acknowledge and to process. And the more we acknowledge and the more we process, the more we can honor our voice and honor our experience and begin to rewrite and reauthor a new story that's not embedded and entrenched in the harm that was caused to us by other people, but rather we learn how to become free within ourselves. Yes, this happened to me. Yes, it was wrong, but this is not who I am. This is an experience or experiences that I had, but they don't define me. God defines who I am. So, what does God say about you?
That's right. Love that, Dr. Myrna. And when I'm listening to you, I can hear a woman who's listening right now, or even the brothers, because we do have some men who listen, and they might find themselves in a similar situation. And they're saying, but my story's connected with someone else's story. So if I speak out about what was done to me, then I'm exposing, and this will cause drama in the family, and we got secrets. And so how does someone handle sharing their sacred story, speaking in truth, reauthoring if they feel like they have to carry the weight of a secret where there'll be backlash for speaking truth about it?
And that's why it's important to begin the healing process in a safe and sacred space. And I recognize that every space is not safe and every space is not sacred. And so every client who comes to see me say they prayed about it and God led them here. So I just believe that we have to pray and we have to seek guidance and instruction from God so that we can make sure that we end up in the right space so we're not further harmed, right? Because the purpose, when we acknowledge our pain, when we acknowledge our story, when we acknowledge our trauma, it should free us and it should liberate us. It should not cause us to feel bound, right? And it's not an overnight process. I wish I could sit here and say it was an overnight process for me. It wasn't, right? It took me a year of going to therapy. And I started in therapy, I was about 29, going every week for a year. And then I went to every other week. And then I went to once a month. And then I went as needed, right? So we have to be able to be ready. We have to be able to know that it's okay, right? And that we are not at fault because of someone else's actions or injurious harm that they caused to us. And a lot of times we carry the burden or the weight of what happened to us, what big mama gonna say, what granddaddy, what uncle, what mama, what cousin, what friend. None of that matters. What matters is your healing. What matters is that you are set free. And the longer we continue to hold our narrative as shame, it will keep us bound. And so part of that vulnerability is to reframe and reauthor your story by not only allowing that shame to live in front of you, not living out of a narrative of shame, but be able to reauthor that shame, right? So you can be able to know that you are more than that. Yes, this happened to you, but that's not who you are. That's not who God purposed you to be and become, right? So who is God calling you to be and become now? And how can you begin the journey? Because it's a journey, it's a process, right? Of being able to acknowledge and give voice to your story. It's your story. This is your life, and life is too short to continue to be under the thumb of shame and the spirit of rejection and abandonment and all these other spirits that we may have attached to us because of our experience of trauma. And so when it goes unprocessed, we're walking around, especially if we in ministry and we never got help. We never got counseling. We never dealt with the abuse. And then we begin to bleed on other people. Then we begin to cause more harm. I believe that the call is sacred. I believe no matter what act of ministry God calls us to is sacred. And so we have to make sure that we are prepared to be able to recognize what's ours and to recognize what's somebody else's and allow God to equip us to be able to have the create this safe and sacred space, especially in our churches, because people are hurting, right? And even when we look at suicide right now among people of color, among African Americans, the number is going up. Why? Because we're hurting and there are no safe and sacred spaces we believe to go to. And if we go to the church, it's not equipped to be able to help us. Even though there are resources like MHT Family Life Center and like what you do, Reverend Jocelyn. There are resources out there, but we have to do a better job, especially as people that are in ministry, to be able to make these resources known and to know, yes, prayer works. I believe in prayer, right? But after I pray for you, I'm going to give you a referral right here to send you over here.
That's right. That's good, Dr. Myrna. Oh, I could speak with you all day. You see the richness that this sister has? This is why she has like 10 dozen books. But because we are short for time, if you were able to offer anyone some final words of encouragement who are beginning their healing journey, they are at that point where you were 29 years old and they're just getting started. They're saying, I need help. What words would you offer them?
I would say that your voice matters and that your story matters. And so choosing to get help, I always would suggest to go to God and pray for guidance so God can put you in the right place at the right time, right? That's number one. And then when you get there, to allow the Spirit of God to be able to work, right? And I know that it can be hard and it can be difficult, right? And you'll have negative voices speaking out to you saying not to share, not to tell, keep it a secret. But I want you to know that's the trick of the enemy, right? The enemy doesn't want you to walk into your purpose, right? But I do believe with everything in me that when you begin the journey and when you are able to free yourself, and we free ourselves by being able to acknowledge the pain, by being able to acknowledge the trauma, by being able to acknowledge the hurt. That's freeing in itself. And the more we begin to speak about it, the more we begin to process it, then we can begin to deconstruct it, to be able to see ourselves separate from that experience, knowing that, okay, this is something that happened to me, but this does not define who I am because this is who God says that I am. And so, how can I get there? We get there by first being able to acknowledge, right? We acknowledge by using our voice. We acknowledge by recognizing that enough is enough. We acknowledge by saying, okay, I'm tired of living under the weight of this shame because it's hindering how I see myself. It's hindering my relationships. It's hindering how I show up in the world, and it's causing me to want to be invisible, right? And we don't want to remain in the state of being invisible. We want to be able to be and become everything that God is calling us to be and become. Recognizing that, yes, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Yes, when God created you for a purpose, right? And the work of the enemy is to sift you like wheat, right? And what I mean by that is to keep you bound because as long as you live in a narrative of shame, you'll never have the courage to be able to find out where God is trying to take you in this season of your life. To know that you are not the sum total of your experiences. And some of us, especially when we've been impacted by sexual trauma, maybe we've done some things that we are shameful of. Maybe we've entered into some relationships. And so part of sexual trauma, we either become over sexual, right? And we take control of it, right? So we didn't have control over what they did to us. So now I'm gonna have control over my own body, and I'm gonna sleep with Henry. I may even sleep with Sally and Jenny and John too, right? That's all a trick of the enemy. And so what I'm encouraging you to do is to give voice to your pain, to be able to recognize that you're hurting and the way that you've been coping, there's other ways for you to be able to cope in a healthy way that gives life to you, right? And when we're able to just step back and recognize it, well, how is my trauma narrative that I'm living out, how is it serving me, right? And so then we'll be able to recognize, oh, okay, I picked up this habit and I picked up this pattern, and now I'm ready to let it go.
Let it go, let it go, let it go. Thank you, Dr. Myrna. I appreciate you so much, sister. And where can people, if they want to learn more about you, where can they find you and all the great books that you've written?
They can reach out to me at drmyrna.com, and all my books are sold on Amazon and also on my website at www.drmyrna.com.
I was so blessed by her time here today. We're grateful to have her here. And thank you so much for tuning into another episode of Faith on the Journey. If you enjoyed this, you know what to do. Subscribe and share this with a friend. Also, I'm blessed to have an after hours conversation with Dr. Myrna on my new YouTube channel for women in the ministry, which is designed to help women who are called to ministry to answer the call. I'm going to have an opportunity to share some details with her or find out some details from her about her journey to answering the call. So be sure, if you are interested in checking out and hearing more from Dr. Myrna, to make your way over to our YouTube channel, subscribe there for Women in the Ministry, and you can find a link to that in the show notes. So that's it for this week's episode, family. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, you stay encouraged and you keep your faith on the journey. I'll see you soon, family.